welcome to monthly Monday Q&A with Felicia Menta from the San Diego Joint Powers Authority, who manages the workers' compensation program for many of our local school districts. And I'm Dr. D, your host. Felicia and I have been working on these kinds of workplace issues with employees with medical conditions for many years. We go back, is it more than 20 now? I don't know. So
more than 20.
Yeah, somewhere early in the 90s. And so we've had a chance to know each other long before either one of us were in our current positions. And so we've learned a lot through the years. And one thing I've been saying to many people throughout the last couple of years, I've been doing this for over 30 years. And I've never seen more changes and more new challenges, more new issues than we have in the last 2.5 years. The issues continue to emerge. It's not over yet. I call it the pandemic evolution. We're still evolving in terms of what's going on and how to handle things. And there's always emerging guidance as well from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at the federal level with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. And then, of course, from the California Fair Employment and Housing Act. Felicia addressed, any big changes on the workers' compensation side, but I think I want to just emphasize first, Felicia, that, a lot of people, sort of get caught up in the workers' compensation piece of things without looking at the bigger picture. And I'd like to have you just comment on that before we get into our 4 hot topics for today.
Such a pleasure to be here, Deborah. Thank you for inviting me. It's always really enjoyable. I got a call from one of our school districts last week, and they had an employee with a non-industrial disability, so it's unknown to them, right? And I explained it's HIPAA protected, and they're protected also under ADA and FEHA, so they have to proceed carefully. They were looking at the employment situation. Work is not getting done. The essential functions aren't getting done because they're out more than they're there. There's a real absence issue going on. And then the rest of the employees on the team are very resentful because they're having to pick up all the work for this person that's out. And where their go-to was discipline, right? They were saying, we're going to start disciplining and we're going to start writing this person up. And I was like, wait, we have to be careful how we proceed. We need to look at the whole case. We need to look at the disability, and we need to look at, do we need to meet? Do we need to talk? Do we need a fit for duty? What do we need? I guess my go-to isn't always, let's start with the discipline track. If we've got a note taking the person off work and they've been off on sick leave, and apparently this is a chronic thing, year over year, they're out a lot. This district also knows that they're working at another district, which is very frustrating because they can work there, but they're not working at their place, right? And so this had a lot of layers to it, but my first go-to, and maybe your first go-to, wouldn't have been, let's start writing them up and put them on a performance improvement plan. And they're off work right now anyway, on sick leave, and let's work on discipline. My first go-to was, what's the disability? How's it impacting the essential functions? Should we meet to talk about that? Do we need a fit for duty so we can try to discover some information? Because all of the notes on information on the leave, it's not a workers' comp claim, so we don't have any information on how long they're going to be out and what even the disability is.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned several things that are actually going to segue into our first couple of topics today as well. Actually, probably all of them. But, one of the things that I tried to emphasize when I open up an interactive process meeting is to be aware that the process can get started in several ways. It could be the employee presents information. It could be that the employer observes difficulties or changes in performance. And that's what I want to really hone in on. And then the third is whether or not it is a workers' comp claim and some information has been passed through on the claim management in the medical treatment that might state where the employee is in a state of recovery. And so I'm going to focus on the second one. Employers observe changes in functioning or shifts in performance that weren't previously there. And before I get into that a little bit further, when the ADA first passed back in 1990, so we just celebrated 32 years, the big emphasis for a number of years was on, does the person have a condition that qualifies as a disability under the law? And there was a lot of time spent, a lot of litigation, and that's when the amendment to the Americans with Disabilities Act surfaced, to say, stop putting so much focus on whether or not the disability qualifies. What we need to be aware of, does it affect a major life condition? And work is a major life condition. And so don't get into the nuances of the disability per se, but let's focus on, okay, we know you have it, so now what do we do? And on that level, then the focus was, and that's where we see a shift in terminology too. I know the laws still say disability, but quite frankly, a lot of people can have medical conditions that impact their ability to be at work, stay at work, and perform the work that may not necessarily rise to the level of a disability. And particularly if we're talking about temporary conditions versus longer term conditions.
Right.
So I'd like to shift the mindset to focusing on medical conditions rather than disability, because disability sort of throws us over into another loop. And quite frankly, a lot of people resent being called as disabled when they don't feel they can. They're limited in certain facets of functioning. And so back to your point, and Felicia, is that the EEOC has also said is that, wait a minute, if you're having performance issues, you don't stop the disciplinary process, but you also need to put it in light of, is there a medical condition that's causing this change in behavior? And then the accommodation process is, how do we restore the employee to performing all the essential functions to the level of productivity or performance necessary? And then that's where you focus on making the accommodations, is how do we get you back there? And I know our folks from Sweetwater can well identify with this one, because we have had a very challenging issue going on for quite a while. But just to provide an accommodation is one thing, but if the accommodation isn't successful in helping the employee restore their ability to perform all the essential functions to the level of productivity or performance necessary, then the accommodation process isn't working. And if the person still insists that they can do the job, then that's where you might shift into the disciplinary aspect. Have another situation that, and this goes into one of the questions too, has a history of an accident at work a few years ago, was able to come back to work, but now she's been demonstrating difficulties in performing her essential functions. And it's a pretty important position as an assistant principal. And so we had an IPM to help us understand what's going on. And she denied that there was anything wrong. And so, then we need to advise you that if you're saying you don't have a medical condition that we can work with to help accommodate you, and try to restore your full functioning, then it does go into the disciplinary aspect. So I know I've touched on a couple things right there, but this is where a lot of people will jump to doing a fitness for duty. And to me, that's sort of out of order, because you oftentimes don't have enough information to work with. And I have found that if we start with an interactive process meeting, let's gather information. What's going on here? And that's whether it's performance, a change in behavior, you're aware now of a medical condition, either the employee has said things to other people or they've actually reported to you. All of those are good reasons to have an interactive process meeting to gather information and sort through the issues. Then you might go to a fitness for duty if things still are challenged.
Certainly, as the work comp program manager and also the manager of our medical provider network, some, but not all, occupational medical physicians and health clinics perform fit for duties. And we do have some contracts that we can pass along to our member districts, contracted rates for some occupational doctors. But just because you treat workers' comp doesn't mean that you do fit for duties for non-industrial disability. So usually what happens is I get a phone call basically saying, can you recommend a fit for duty physician for a non-industrial illness? Then I will say, what is the non-industrial illness? How is it performing the essential work functions? And they'll say, we don't know. We just know they're off work, or we've observed they're having cognitive difficulties, or they seem depressed, or we think they might be on some kind of mood altering, whether it be a prescription medication or alcohol or drugs, that they might be using substances at work, which is a real problem, right? And especially if you're, in front of children. So front facing. So that is how they usually start. We just want to do a fit for duty. We're not sure what kind of doctor we want to use. Give us some recommendations. And I sort of back it up to, wait a minute, should we talk first to get a little bit more information about the disability, what problems they seem to be having, what problems you're observing, what notes they do have or could bring in that could maybe start you on your way as to whether this is a psychological or a neurological or a internal medicine or it could be a regular occupational health doctor, which is really like more like an MD, more like a general practitioner. So I get a little challenged when it's just a request, make a recommend, send us some doctors for fit for duty that work with a lot of the employers and school districts in the area. Whereas I kind of feel it's a cart before the horse a little bit, right?
Well, absolutely, because you do need to. That's one of the things that the ADA says. It applies to employers just like it applies to employees. You have to have an appropriate doctor who's skilled and qualified to treat the condition that is being claimed. And so, if you don't know what the condition is, how do you know where to refer them to? And so, if it's like a brain trauma, that's one thing. If it's anxiety, that's another thing. Or if it is a physical injury, then again, making sure that we've got appropriately qualified doctors to evaluate the situation. And so there are a couple thoughts that come to my mind around that, Felicia, is that again, I advocate doing it on IPM, not just because I'm the facilitator of them, but to me, that's like the starting ground is an employer having a conversation with their employee about information that's been presented or observations that have been garnered, and again impacting someone's ability to be at work, stay at work, and perform their what's happening here. That's what the ADA wants you to have, is that conversation, to be interactive with that employee. And from an employer's perspective, it's like a foolproof way, but it's going to greatly mitigate, almost eliminate any claims that you haven't engaged the employee in the interactive process. And so it's like a good faith effort right from the get-go, but it's also the employer's opportunity to explain to the employee what goes on when a medical condition presents itself in the workplace, the employer's obligations to engage them, but also to educate the employee about the process and the steps involved. I oftentimes say employees, many employees at all kinds of levels seldom have any knowledge of this whole process until something happens to them. Okay. So this is a whole new area, and medical conditions are scary enough, but when now they think that their work might be threatened in some form or fashion, then it becomes even more stressful and difficult. And by engaging the employee earlier, now you can actually form a partnership in collaboration with the employee to make things go smoother. Otherwise, things, as we've seen in many cases, is how contentious it can become. And then you get non-cooperation. It becomes even more difficult, and it becomes even more difficult to address, again, those performance issues that tend to go on. And so absenteeism, or chronic absenteeism, another thing that is a trigger for an employer to get that employee involved as soon as possible, to say what's going on, here's the different laws involved, and here are the different benefits available, and want you to be prepared to know what's coming and how we're trying to work with you, not against you. And so,
and then you can address those issues of your team as being overburdened because you're gone more than you're here. And so they're really having to pick up the slack and do all of your work. And then if we also have knowledge from another school district that you're working there, but you can't work here, we want to talk about that and get clarity around that, because these are all very important issues. And then you can lead into why we need a fit for duty if it's determined that that's what you need, is more medical clarity. Because the other, as the work comp program manager, the other question I get a lot is, we have different reports, PTP, QME, AME reports in the work comp case. We don't have clarity. We are meeting, we're scheduling an IPM, and we've got 2 or 3 different doctor's notes. One says they can work, one says they can't work, or they can work with restrictions. Now we don't know what to do. We want to get a fit for duty. And I'm like, kind of before we jump to that, we might want to meet first, talk about the different medical opinions, and see how we can cure the conflict. Sometimes the employee has ideas how to cure. Sometimes they can go back to the doctors. They can have influence in the situation, right? Hey, we can't bring you back to work because one doctor says you can work and one doctor says you can't, and one doctor says you can, but with restrictions. Now we're not sure what is safe. And under ADA and FEHA, we need to keep you safe. And that's outside and above workers' comp, right? Outside, and has different litigation attached to it. So I always feel like we don't want to jump to a fit for duty to cure discrepancies between medical reports. We can get clarity sometimes with the employee and with the doctors that have the differing opinions. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes, I'm not saying a fit for duty is never a thing, but in workers' comp, they can't accept the fit for duty. So that note means nothing to them. The PTP rules in a work comp claim. He determines everything about the disability. And then in ADA, we have all the notes, right? All the notes come in. So it makes it hard. And then when there's a QME, AME, that might overrule in work comp the PTP's report, the primary treating physicians, but in ADA, we're looking at all of it, trying to make sense of it. So it's not that a fit for duty is never done in a work comp case, but I always would say, are we trying to resolve the conflict in the workers' comp system before we pay for another doctor and evaluation to come into the kitchen that already has a lot of cooks in it anyway, right?
Yep, you're absolutely right on that. And so from the employer's perspective, the fitness for duty is really more to address the direct threat issue. Can the employee safely return performing all the essential functions to the level of performance expected under the current working conditions? So that's where fitness for duty really comes into play. It's for the ADA side of things, but it can be very useful when we have those conflicting medical reports on the workers' comp side. I just did an IPM the other day where the employee's actually been off of work for 3 years. And we did an IPM back earlier in the summer, and the AME had, gave all kinds of limitations. And yet the employee was saying, I'm on this new medication now. I can work, blah, blah, blah. And then he also had a doctor, his own primary treating, that said he could return to work without limitations. And so the fitness for duty can be definitely used to clarify those conflicting pieces of information. But in this case too, he'd been off of work for so many years. And so we did get the report back. We met just earlier this week. And it was determined that it was safe for him to return to work and that the medication did in fact change his situation. But he's been gone so long that his level of position is no longer available. So to take him back to work, he's going to have to take a lower position,
right?
Because after 1 year, positions aren't normally kept open, sometimes even after 6 months. So that was a very interesting situation. And now everybody feels safe and that he can do the job well. We've had an independent evaluation current, not something that's several months old or a year old, and certainly for a medical condition that was 3 years old. So we've set up a plan of action for how he's going to return to work. Interestingly, because he's been gone so long, and finally because he was determined maximum medical improvement, his benefits, workers' comp benefits, stopped. And so he actually went and got another job while he was waiting for all this to come. So we had to clarify, we're here for this job and this is the schedule. What about that other job? Because working 2 jobs is stressful, fatiguing. And so those kinds of things will, could aggravate your condition. Oh no, I plan to quit my job and I want to work here. It's like, okay.
That is a very interesting case. I saw such an interesting report on one of our workers' comp. The interplay with workers' comp and ADA and FEHA just make things very complicated for employers in the district, right? So that's why I always say stop and let's all talk before we proceed. Make sure that we're doing the right thing. We don't want to just always do the same thing. And we really have to look at case by case because they're all so different. But we had an AME report that came back that said that the employee couldn't work. They're a qualified injured worker. These are old terms. We don't use these terms, right? They need to be rehabilitated into a new job. And we were like, what does that mean? Where are the work restrictions? Well, I think what the doctor meant was they can't go back to work, but the doctor can't make that decision, right? The doctor talked to the patient, obviously, about what their job was. And then on the return to work disability section, because they made him permanent stationary, so he's permanently disabled, and said he can't work, like ever. And we were like, what? Because that never happens, right? You can't be on TTD anymore because you're PNS. So what are we supposed to do now? And so we were like, we have to get clarity, right? Because you needed to give us permanent work restrictions, and perhaps the district will meet with the employee and they'll decide we can't bring him back to work. You, the doctor, can't decide that. You don't even know enough about our workplace, and you don't know what the alternative jobs. He just declared the person like never able to work again. And this is a younger person, right? And so we were thinking, but that's just the doctor not understanding the interplay with workers' comp and the ADA and FEHA. That report doesn't do us any good. Right.
Well, there are 2 things that get triggered in my mind as you said that, Felicia, is that a medical doctor is there to treat conditions. Okay. They know very little about the world of work. And so that's
legal issues, right?
Right. And that's why it's so important. Like if you are considering a fitness for duty, you have to have the appropriate kind of doctor who's skilled and qualified. There's special training for that.
Right.
To be a QME or to do a fitness for duty, there's specialized training for that. And so not just any doctor will do. The second thing that ties into what you just said is how often employees will come back with a note from their doctor who is prescribing the accommodation to be made. And I always like to say, well, thank you very much. Your doctor is there to identify your limitations or symptoms from your condition, not to tell the employer how to accommodate you. That's what happens here in this meeting.
Right.
And well, my doctor says, well, your doctor can say all kinds of things, but that doesn't mean that your employer has to automatically implement what they say. It has to be taken in context of the business environment. I always like to say it's a balance between what the employee needs and what the employer needs, which then takes me on to the other piece that's big in the ADA that you referenced earlier, is that by somebody who had a chronic pattern of absenteeism and not performing all the essential functions, those kinds of factors are what lead to undue hardship for the employer.
Right.
Okay, we have to look at safety of the employee first. Will they worsen, or could others be harmed by their inability to do certain parts of their job, even with accommodation? And then we need to be careful not to increase the burden on others to take up the slack. So that's the other key piece of that. And so that chronic absenteeism or attendance, that gets into what we call a record or history of a medical condition in the workplace. And so one of the things I know that some of our participants here have heard me say before is that somebody's got an ongoing condition and they're absent a lot. We have to take a look at, have they even worked the requisite hours required for a Family Medical Leave Act? Because if you haven't met that threshold, then that would suggest that you're too medically disabled, in this case, I will use that word, to work, because that's how FMLA is set up, is you have to work at least so many hours to be protected for your medical condition. But if you're not, then that would suggest by other laws that they're really not medically able to work at this point. And that ongoing undue hardship for the employer. And again, that was certainly the situation in this other case I referenced earlier, where it's been since 2018, I think I've been in 7 IPMs trying to help accommodate her. And she had a work-related injury and then a non-work-related condition, and then something else even. And she's still only performing 25% of her job. And she goes, well, you have to accommodate me. Oh, the employer has numerous times. Here's all the documentation, just to provide an accommodation isn't enough. It has to help somebody actually restore full functioning, even with their medical condition, and with accommodations where appropriate. And that has not been happening. And I see too many employers who continue the accommodation process when those glaring factors, objective evidence is present. And wait a minute, let's have we need to come back and have an interactive process and go over that and lay out the next steps.
Well, and I think it's really important to document what you're doing. We have so many people retiring and new people coming in to the HR and risk function. I have seen some things kind of get dropped through the cracks. We had an IPM, I think it was a year ago last spring. It was a temporary accommodation through the end of the school year because of COVID and all the changes. And then they were going to reevaluate it at the end of the school year to determine what was going to happen in the fall. And this was last spring. And then now the fall is here, and they called me and said, wait, what are we doing? Are we putting them back to work? I'm sure that's why you've been doing so many IPMs since the beginning of school. They said, are we putting a sub in, or are they coming back to work? Because the person just assumed that the accommodation that they had for last spring was going on forever. And I said, well, wait a minute. Don't the notes say that you guys were going to meet again? But see, that got dropped because then they got a new HR person, and he didn't know that there had been a discussion, that there was no agreement that this was going to go into the next school year, because it is okay. During COVID, we made some accommodations that were like, we can do this till the end of the school year. We can do this till this time. And then we're going to reassess and see what we're going to do, for the next school year, before the next school year starts. But you know what happened? School was starting, it was like the day before, and they called and were just in a panic, right? So it's easy sometimes to, miss some of the continuity and all the notes. I think you do have to go back and take a look at the last meeting and what the discussion was.
Absolutely. There's again, two things that get generated for me is that I had a situation very similar to yours, non-work related situation. We had met last fall, and there had been a couple of years of not super high levels of absenteeism, but enough where it was causing problems in the delivery of services. And so we had met last fall to address the situation, came up with a plan of action. In not hearing anything, I interpreted that things were all going okay. But the two things, the employee never put into implementation the agreement set up with the local principal and the director of the program she was working in, and never followed up with HR, say, well, what are we doing? And then HR had a change in leadership at the middle of the school year. They were totally unaware of what had already been done. And so then we came back again and was learned that nothing ever happened. And so we explored some options and met again, and we put some things into place. But the interactive process meeting is again to educate the employee about their level of responsibilities. It's a two-way street here. Employee, you have just as much responsibilities to stay in touch with human resources as human resources does to reaching back out to you. So you have to take some responsibility here. You've got the condition. If something's not happening, oftentimes HR risk management may not know about it if the implementation of an accommodation was left in the hands of the local administration. And so that's another reason why it's so early, as I like to say, having an interactive process meeting earlier than later is actually your best defense on all kinds of levels. And investing in a IPM, tying it back to the fitness for duty, is oftentimes far cheaper than a fitness for duty. So it's a wise investment of time and money, whoever facilitates it.
Right, whether you do it on your own or whether you use your wonderful facilitating skills. We have seen a real rise in all of the school district employers in the county. It's kind of affecting across the board with mental health and psych claims. And we recently, I've had several calls for putting people into the 𝐸𝐻 mental health counseling program. And we've had some problems with students and suicide that have caused staff to get very upset, where I know last week we had critical incident response from MHN that had to come out to a district. I think they got out there within 2 hours of a notification of the problem that occurred at the district that the staff were really upset about. So certainly I know we had an assistant principal that was really was having some mental health issues, and that job is very difficult, right? Performing at a high level, lots and lots of stress, start of the school year, so stress is really heightened. And we have a challenge on the work comp side that perhaps doesn't exist on the non-industrial side, but I think it exists in healthcare, that there's a problem with access to care. And you guys, this is for counseling, this is for psychologists, and Dr. Dupree, you well know this as a licensed clinical psychologist yourself, and for psychiatrists. The waits are getting longer, the time to get people in is getting longer, and this isn't a comp problem. This is just a healthcare problem. You would notice it even if you were trying to get family members in on the group side. In talking with Sharp and Kaiser, they're saying that we just don't have enough psychologists and psychiatrists in San Diego County, period, to treat the amount and level of mental health issues that we're having. So we have to get very creative when we have people that obviously you're off work, you're using sick leave, or it's paid through workers' comp, one of the two, right? Depending on the determination. But we have been seeing more difficulty in getting our work comp people in right away. So I want them sent to ACMED for the first visit. They will not make determinations on causation. They cannot. It's outside their scope. What they can do is determine work or not work, take them off pending a psychologist evaluation. Right now, you guys, this is taking us 6 to 8 weeks. That's how long it's taking. It's bad. We're trying to shore that tie up, but that's where it is. Because in workers' comp, we have to use licensed clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. We can't use MFTs, unfortunately. 𝐸𝐻N is a way to send people. Even if we have a claim in delay, you can put them into the 𝐸𝐻N program, or they can go through group health, because when a claim is in delay, AOE, COE, it hasn't been accepted, hasn't been denied. Yes, they can treat under the work comp for the 10,000, but they can also treat in group health if they so choose until the claim's accepted. So my point is, wherever they can get in the fastest, get them in, get them care. That's my priority. So that was just my message about what's going on with mental health and psych claims right now, and stress claims.
Yes, I am licensed. And for the record, I'll clarify though, is that I'm not a licensed clinical psychologist. Okay. I have a doctorate in psychology. And so I am at the doctorate level, but I chose not to late in life to pursue the second licensing. So I still operate under my LMFT, which is why I don't do more of the workers' comp and QME stuff. But I've always had this, a part-time practice seeing patients one-on-one too. And sometimes the volume of requests coming in is overwhelming for me, because it's just like, it's definitely up there. And we're seeing some interesting cases too on the mental health side, is that even though they've been through COVID and, the initial onset, I should say, of when COVID first happened, but, the whole idea now that more and more school districts are requiring employees to come back on work on site. I know the community colleges are a little bit more, I don't want to say lax because it's not lax, but they've taken a different kind of approach given the age of their student population. And
Right.
so many, at least the community colleges I work with, have allowed people to choose whether they're working remote or not this last year. But now, because there's an increase of student demand for on-site services and instructional classes, they're now setting, one in particular is requiring that employees be on site, on campus, at least 3 days per week to do their work, and then they can still remote work for 2 days. And even there, we're getting pushed back, in terms of employees feeling, they've gotten very accustomed to working at home and they want to keep working at home. And of course, if there's a medical condition, then we have to take a look at that. And one thing I always emphasize, EEOC has always said remote work is a form of accommodation long before COVID, but it's always on a case-by-case basis. And just because one gets it doesn't mean the other one gets it. So again, it's all about balancing that business need with the employee need.
And most of the school districts do have a virtual academy. Doesn't have a ton of staff in it, but there are students that wanted to continue virtually even after the COVID numbers got better. And that's where a lot of those accommodations are, right? Because you're doing them both on the industrial and non-industrial, is putting them in some of the virtual academy. A lot of the staff that are front facing and work at school sites, though, it's 5 days a week, in the business office or in the HR office, it's 5 days a week back on site. And we have lost some staff in HR and risk management that were very good, and having to replace them now and retrain all over because there's not a great deal of flexibility there in that.
Well, that sort of touches on both we've already started talking about our third topic, mental health conditions as schools reopen. Again, we have definitely seen an increase in those kinds of conditions. And so my encouragement to everybody, it goes back to have an interactive meeting. What's going on here? What's causing the stress or the increased anxiety or whatever the employee is reporting, and what can be done to mitigate those factors? And then to think about a transition plan. I know I have one in place at a community college where, the goal is to, because the college district is now requiring 3 days minimum, that the goal is then to use the next 60 days, again, temporary accommodation to transition or start with 1 day a week. Then move to 2 days a week. Yeah. And so that by January, when it's expected that the campus may jump to 4 or 5 days required on campus, and again, it depends on the job, but are there things that the employee can productively do at home on a transitional basis? But to get the IPM out there right away, find out what's going on, and then develop a plan of action that can be transitional in over a short period of
plan. That's what we do with like amputations and really bad head injuries and spinal injuries. If we can get them back 4 hours a day, in a lighter schedule, 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, and work them slowly back up to their normal schedule. I think for a lot of the mental health conditions, since we're kind of referencing that item, they have the most challenging for a lot of the districts and employers work restrictions, temporary work restrictions, because they're work restrictions around people. Can't work around this supervisor anymore who's triggering you. Can't work around this coworker anymore that's triggering you. You can't work by the superintendent because that's triggering you. Or you can't work on this campus because this campus is triggering you. You can work at any other campus in the school or at the district office, but not right here, because this is the place where the event occurred, maybe where they were attacked or stabbed or, unbitten or something happened. And another thing that we have been seeing too, and it's been going on all along, but it's happening quite a bit now too, is special ed, right? We have stress claims, but they arise because why? They're kicked, bitten, punched, assaulted. That's a different kind of a job. I do see lots of districts doing a lot of things, very creative things. I'm sure you do too, with meeting with the special ed, both on the instructional assistants and on the certificated teachers, and moving them temporarily out of special ed to kind of decompress a little bit. These are complicated issues, right? But I have seen that where they've gotten really, the districts have gotten really creative rather than no. And what's causing this? Our next bulleted item is the shortage of staff. We have, most of our districts have short staff everywhere and short subs or temps backing up the staff. So you have to get creative. It can't just be, no, we can't take you 4 hours a day. You have a shift change. We can't accommodate that. No, we can't work you at a different site. That's going to throw everyone off. And I just go back to my regular thing. If we're short staffed and we need the people, could we figure out a way to get to yes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Could we figure out a way temporarily, this is not their full-time forever job, but temporarily moving them and accommodating, because a lot of times these psychologists and psychiatrists restrictions are people and places. They're not physical restrictions. They're not, you can't use your arm over 10 pounds. They're not, you can't work above your head. They're not, you're no longer crawling on the ground and climbing up ladders. They're different things, but we just have to be very creative. And if we're short staffed and we're short subs, then that's where we put these people, right? I mean, where we try, that's what we try to do.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I've got an interesting case too, where a teacher had been accosted by a student and, had some limitations. And long story short, what we did is, because of some change of personnel, we revisited the situation. There were some updates on the workers' comp side of it. And then making sure that the employee put into place a communication plan for the employee to immediately contact the principal's office, if there was any concern about this one student coming near her again, because there had been some crossovers, not recent, but we had to make sure and ensure her safety. So I'm going to, Jennifer, go ahead and unmute yourself. I see your hands raised.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I just had a quick thought, and thank you guys so much, because this has definitely been informative. And going off of what you just said, Felicia, I would love to hear more about some of the creative ideas that other districts are doing, because here at our district, we are seeing a high rise of those requests. And we just actually got a request last week from someone that is an IA within our district, that their doctor is saying that they cannot work in a fundamentals classroom, right? And that they have to be transferred to a moderate classroom, only stemming from a workers' comp claim where they had a threatening incident with a student. And although the student's no longer in that classroom, they're asking to be switched permanently to another type of classroom. So I would be curious to know what other districts are doing, rather than just saying, no, sorry, we can't do that, right? And so that would be great. And then my other question would be, I know as employers, whether under ADA or FEHA or workers' comp, we have a duty and obligation to engage with our employees, whether there's a request for accommodation or a perceived medical condition. But my question is, what happens when you do reach out to that employee that may have a perceived medical condition and they just do not want to engage with you under the interactive process meeting? Like, what's our obligation to still try to hold a meeting? Like, what does that look like if they do not want to engage? I know we're still documenting on our end that we're trying to reach out, but is there anything else that we can do on our end? Because I know that sometimes we engage and they don't want to, and we know that because it's perceived medical condition that we're trying to assist, but the site may want to go through with disciplinary matters. So is there anything else that we can do to try to show that we're trying to assist the employee?
Great question.
That's great questions. And Deborah, I'm going to defer to you on quite a bit of the second one. On the first one, I just saw last week a really interesting case. It's a psych stress claim. They filed a comp claim. It's an employee who got very stressed out. They deal with parents. And in this particular situation, it was a parent, and, there was a lot of heated conversation or berating, I guess, of the employee. And so you're right, the treater on the work comp claim restricted the employee from working around that parent. Or any parents, really, like parents, for a while they're treating and getting everything kind of calmed down. You're right, that particular district moved, because this parent is at that site. Jen, you know what they did? They moved this particular employee temporarily. They needed help in another site. So they moved her to a different site, different supervisor, different site. And and she's really not working with parents right now. So it's not even like different parents. They just put her in a different role temporarily because they have some other people out and they could use her. So it ended up working out. It's not her forever job. She will eventually have to go back to the site unless there's some kind of permanent restriction. But I thought that was creative, right? They didn't try to like move the parent or move her, because maybe the parent could come on site and see her. Parent's such a trigger because of the issues that have gone on. They just put her in a different physical spot where she's never going to run into the parent.
Yeah. So to build on that, Jennifer, is that, again, the accommodation process should always focus on the employee with the medical condition. And so moving parents or moving students is not the answer, or moving coworkers. That came up in another case as well.
Right.
And so, but to look at temporary reassignment is definitely doable and permissible under the ADA and PHA as far as temporarily while someone's recovering. Is there a business need? And so this two things there is that one, as far as a long-term assignment, it's got to be an open position for which the person qualifies. And some people think you should make up a job for them, and no, that's not the way it goes. So longer term, it's got to be an open position, but on a temporary basis, if you go back to your 60 plus 60 or 90 plus 90, be very clear to the employee that this is a temporary reassignment. And it might not even be an actual position, but it could be somewhere that your organization needs help. Okay. And so that's, again, temporarily. We'll put you here while you're recovering. Temporarily, we need help. It's not a regular position, but once we hit that 60 and 60 threshold, or 90 plus 90, stop, you got to come back. And where are we now? And we've got some cases like that right now. Yeah. Now, for somebody who won't engage, and yet there's perceived a medical condition or observations, this is where you might have to turn back to the disciplinary process. Document your efforts as far as your attempts to accommodate, your attempts to engage. And at this point, because we are observing difficulties in performance or attendance, things like that, our goal is to try to accommodate, work with you about those concerns. And when you do not engage, then we have to resort to our usual personnel practices, and then that might writing them up for attendance or not performing all the essential functions. And so that goes back to one of our earlier things, is that just because you have an employee with a medical condition doesn't mean you defer or ignore your performance process or disciplinary process, but you put them on notice. There are issues here. And because we perceive that there may be medical things, or maybe you've shared this with coworkers, there's this whole process where we try to work with you to restore you to full functioning, and so we'll work with you to help get you back and get a transition plan. But if you choose not to engage, then we have no choice but to go back to our usual employment practices when it comes to disciplinary procedures. So don't stop it, put it on due notice, but get that interactive process going at the same time, and defer the disciplinary process at that point, once you put them on notice, and then you engage them on the interactive process. And so it's really about trying to forge that sort of friendly engagement so they don't become adversarial and take other courses of action. That's what this is really about. Keep people working. This is why the ADA is so much more challenging to manage than FMLA, because FMLA is very prescriptive. ADA is case by case basis, and here's the framework for what you have to do. And so you almost have to have an interactive process meeting.
And if you screw up, you could get a $35 million.
Yeah.
There's that too.
Exactly.
We'll be talking more about that on our October 6th.
And I will be there.
Good. Well, I just do want to wrap up on our fourth one and let everybody go, because I know it's been a good conversation, and thank you for your comments, Jennifer. We talk about people who may have needs to work from home for medical reasons, but because we are talking about the shortages of staffing and so forth, it behooves you as an employer to, take a look at the employee's requests and say, is there work that somebody could safely perform from home in order to retain them? Because people are leaving. And Felicia and I know that people have left really good jobs and they're really good employees, but they want that flexibility that they've become accustomed to. And so having a little bit more flexible approach to your employees, even when they don't have medical conditions, could really help with retention and quality of work. And because that can fall into another area not covered by my medical conditions as far as EEOC practices. And I know the private sector is really struggling with this as far as, a lot of CEOs want all their employees back on site, but the pushback is huge. And they're not doing very well. So good people are leaving good companies because of the lack of flexibility and consideration of their individual employee needs.
Right. And so I changed my view. The flexibility the claims team wanted was to work from home forever. And so I said, okay, you're valuable to me. I want to have my dedicated team. We can be flexible, and we can do that when you feel it's safe from COVID. We would like you to go back and meet with districts and training. But in the meanwhile, I will do all of that, and you can continue to work from home because we really care about you. So, but that's a different union. We have unions and we have different situations and complexity. But you're right. I got very flexible because when I saw the Great Resignation happening, a lot of the TPAs, Sedgwick and Gallagher Bassett, class and all of their claims team are leaving because they're going to force them to come back into the office 3 days a week or 5 days a week. And they don't want to do that. They want to work. They've been very clear. They want to work remotely 5 days a week. If they certainly showed they can do it during the pandemic and we're able to continue a high quality of work, then why should we not continue to accommodate that, right? So
yeah, and I'll share with that real quickly before, because I'm one college district, they've taken a very serious look at, okay, yeah, we did it, but were we really accomplishing what we needed to do? And that's why this particular college district is making a requirement of, 3 days minimum on site, because what they have found is that while we survived through it by working remotely, there actually was an impact on the quality and quantity of services to students and into the community served. And so that's why they're pushing, is that no, we did it, but we're doing it to the level of quality that we're accustomed to doing. We want to get back to that. We want to.
Right. Service could be affected if you have front facing, individuals. So every job is different, right?
Yep. Case by case basis, not just for medical conditions, but other things as well. So, well, I want to say thank you to everyone who's been here today and for listening and engaging. And we hope that you found our topics valuable and insightful in terms of how to continue moving forward with this evolution. And a reminder that a link to the recording will be available in a few more days to those of you who registered. And do pass it on, share it on. Again, we meet once a month, and so we'll be coming up again in October, and usually about the third Monday of the month. And you can pre-register, go ahead and register for everything coming up. And please, if you have topics or issues that you feel would be beneficial to raise to this, please email me so we can, Felicia and I meet about 10 days ahead of time to talk about, okay, what's hot, what's not, and what do we want to focus on. And a lot of this comes from situations that we encounter through folks like you. And so if there is something specific you'd like us to address, just let us know, and we'll be happy to include that in the mix.
And please register for the October 6th work comp training meeting from 9 to 12. We're going to be doing a hybrid. This is our first time. We'll be in person speaking at the county office at 𝐥𝐞𝐢𝐥𝐞, but you can also Zoom in if you'd like, if that works better for your schedule.
Okay, Felicia, thank you for doing that. I was a little confused myself being a speaker. Is that are we doing this live or
yes, both. We're doing both, which
great.
we've never done. Flexibility and compassion. So
yeah, there we go. So do you want to put a contact information for how they can get more information if they haven't received that invitation yet?
I think I've sent it out to everybody.
Oh, okay.
So I think we're good. I think so.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Felicia, for all your insight and expertise in helping educate our communities. And I always like to say, I could be the person with the employee with the medical condition, could be you too. And so, think about how you might want to be treated and what you'd like to see done. Okay. Thank you again. Have a great week ahead.
Pleasure, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.